Hello and good morning from Chicago, and good afternoon to everybody in Europe. My name is Corin Little, and I'm the director and organizer of Out of Sight Chicago, a public performance program. And today I am with Meghan Beitiks, and we are talking about her performance practice. But before I get into that, I just want to give a land acknowledgement and state that I am coming to you, I am transmitting to you from the ancestral homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Adawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi peoples. Out of Sight as an organization is very interested in the questions of ownership of land. Sight, S-I-T-E, is in our name, and Out of Sight is really about holding up to a lens to what is invisible. And last week we talked about water and how water is impacting indigenous communities. And today, in my conversation with Meghan, we'll be really talking about air and breath. And Meghan Beitiks works with associations and dissociations of culture, nature, and science. She analyzes perceptions of ecology through the lenses of sight, history, emotions, and her body in order to produce work that analyzes relationships with non-human. The work emerges as video, performance, and installation, writing, or photography, depending on what arises from her process and her research practice. She received a BA in Theatre Arts from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and she studied playwriting, acting, movement, and scene design, and she has a FA in Performance Arts from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which is where I first met Meghan, where she studied bioart, social practice, environmental chemistry, and performance methodologies. She was a Fulbright Student Fellow and a recipient of the Claire Rosen and Samuel Edis Foundation Prize for Emerging Artists and a MacDowell Colony Fellow. She has taught performance at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where we were colleagues, and she exhibited her work at the iPark Environmental Art Biennale, Grace Exhibition Space in Brooklyn, Defibrillator Performance Art Gallery in Chicago, and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and the House of Artists in Moscow. And she first performed with Out of Sight in 2013, and actually was part of the support team in 2012. So we have a long history of working together, both as colleagues and as artists. And she is currently an interdisciplinary studio art lecturer at the University of Florida. So it is a great pleasure to be with you here today, Meghan. And you created a live performance for us last night. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. Yeah, and I also wanted to note that in Gainesville, Florida, where I'm streaming from, I'm coming from the unceded territory of the Timucua and Seminole peoples. So I appreciate the starting off with a land acknowledgement. But yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about the performance last night. It was a collaboration with a longtime friend of mine, Ray Oppenheimer, who is a lighting and media designer based in the Bay Area in California. So we spent several weeks kind of developing the work together virtually through Skype and using a number of different programs processing OBS Isadora to kind of create a pandemic meditation, as it were. So yeah, I feel really lucky to be part of the lineup last night. I was really excited by all of the work that was shown. And then, I don't know, it's just nice to have those kinds of points of gathering in these times. So thanks.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to start off by and I just want to share with everybody that the links to the live performance are on the Facebook and through social media networks. And you can also see it on Experimental Sound Studio's Twitch channel. And it will be live there for the next 2 weeks before they move it over to YouTube. But we have a link to on website as well on Meghan and Ray's page. So the first piece we're going to show you a couple of performances that Meghan has done over the last, I think these are kind of over the last 6 years. And so the first one is untitled, and then in brackets it's Hinckley. So
understand.
He wanted you to know that the legal limit for hexavalent chromium is 0.05 parts per million, and at the rate you mentioned, 0.58. It could be responsible for the cancers in that family you asked about, the Jameson. Come on.
It was possible to enrich microorganisms capable of tolerating and reducing very high chromium-6 concentrations. The kinetic parameters of the reduction process indicate that the tertiary enrichment culture has a significant potential for bioremediation of chromium-6 laden wastewaters.
Hey, come on. Come on. Look at these readings. PG&E's own technicians documented toxic levels of hexavalent chromium in those wells on numerous occasions.
The Water Board is the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, lead agency for the environmental investigation and chromium groundwater cleanup at the PG&E Hinckley Compressor Station. The compressor station is located about 3 miles southeast of the town community of Hinckley in San Bernardino, California. As of 2008, this contamination created a plume of chromium in groundwater extending about 2 miles to the north of the compressor station and about 1.3 miles wide. As of late 2012, the plume was much larger than in 2008 and was approximately 7 miles in length and 2 to 2.5 up to 2.4 miles wide at its widest point.
It's impressive.
I don't want to feel it all over again and then not have it come out right. I don't know if I could handle that.
I want you to know something, Ed. It is not about the number. It is about the way my work is valued. Are you going to be something else that I have to survive?
Contaminated groundwater is pumped from the subsurface, also called the aquifer, to contain the contamination plume.
Hey, come on.
Agricultural reuse, also called agricultural treatment, land treatment, or agricultural units. Hexavalent chromium in the extracted groundwater is converted to trivalent chromium by contact with organic matter in the soil as it infiltrates through the soil.
Come on.
Hexavalent chromium is the toxic form of chromium. Trivalent chromium has very low toxicity.
Now, do you understand? This is serious.
And what, Ed? I'm not serious?
You're emotional. Look, you're erratic. You say any goddamn thing that comes into your head. You make this personal, and it isn't.
Not personal? That is my work! My sweat, my time away from my kids. If that's not personal, I don't know what is.
Subsurface treatment, also called in situ treatment, or in situ reactive zones, or IRZ treatment.
Come on. Come on.
Carbon substances, primarily ethanol, are injected into the groundwater aquifer to stimulate microbial activity, which creates a reducing environment that converts the hexavalent chromium into trivalent chromium. Reduce, in this context, refers to a chemical reaction that adds electrons to a chemical species. A reduction of hexavalent chromium to trivalent chromium means that the chemical reaction adds 3 electrons to each hexavalent chromium molecule, which reduces its oxidation state from +6 to +3, thereby converting hexavalent chromium to trivalent chromium.
Hello, and yes, we will post a link to that in the chat, Dimple, so that you can review the whole piece again. And Meghan, would you like to introduce this next piece?
Yeah, the next piece is, so that was Untitled Hinkley, and we can talk more about that, I guess, after the next video. But the next piece is called Flicker Fusion Threshold, and it's a reperformance for camera for a short piece that was originally performed at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago in 2016 on a night of performance with Liz Enns, Lindsay French, and Marissa Lee Benedict. So.
Hello and welcome, and thank you all for joining us in the room today, to Dimple and Wanapa. We've got a lot of people from around the world joining us today, and so thank you so much. So, Meghan, the first question I would like to ask you is really focused on the audience response to this work, and it's in specific relation to the first video that we showed today, entitled Untitled Hinckley. And I was so thinking about the audience response, and how are you using theatrical devices to communicate or evoke a response from the audience? Yes.
That's a good question. So I feel like, so when we say theatrical devices, I feel like that we're really talking about choices that we are making as performers in terms of our craft, and that there are like techniques. So I come from this undergraduate training in theater, so there are normative techniques for projecting your voice, like having amazing posture, having a neutral spine, like all of these things, which I had learned some of in that undergraduate training. But that I think part of my current performance practice like draws on that, where it's applicable, but in both of these pieces, my body is not pretty or neutral or you know, composed in what you might consider to be like theater with a capital T sort of sense. And I think that part of embracing breath as a theatrical device or like a performative choice is not only looking to connect to breath as itself a connective ecological force. Like conceptually, I'm thinking about like, oh, breath is a molecular exchange, but also thinking very much of the vulnerability that's inherent in breath, especially, I mean, I feel like we feel that really keenly now in these times, but that in general, that breath is something that we associate with the vulnerability of our bodies, not only as a means of like sustaining them, but as a reaction or a kind of processing to exertion or trauma. So we're out of breath when we've just done a lot of work or exerted ourselves. We breathe heavily when we're trying to recover from an intense experience. An interest in breath kind of stems for me from a meditation practice that I've had in kind of spurts over the years, that's based in a kind of Vipassana training, but I've had like many instances in my life where meditation has served as a useful grounding tool, and wanting to explore that aspect of it, and also its more I want to say performative qualities, but I know that word has like a lot of different connotations. So maybe like its role as a theatrical device as well.
Yeah, so and I think in that first video piece, you're really layering. So you've got the narration of which is almost like a documentary. It's a text from a documentary of what are the impacts of pollution to the air in the site of Hinckley. And then you have the performative act of you actually breathing, and this becomes a physical experience for the audience watching the performance, which creates, and I'm interested in that kind of how that there's a kind of disconnect. I would call it a Brechtian device of what he defines as an alienating device between the narrated text and the breath work, and how that then creates a physiological response in the audience his body, which, because your breathing is connected to, we've got the vagus nerve connecting the vocal cords to the heart, it kind of physiologically creates this empathetic reaction to what's happening there. And, how you're using, it's interesting how you're employing these theatrical devices to
to articulate a cohesive work. So I think like Brechtian is a really good term for it. I'm definitely pulling from Brecht in a lot of different aspects of my work. I feel like what it's doing in the Hinckley piece is different than what it's been doing in my later work, which we're not necessarily talking about here, although last night's performance kind of touched on that for sure.
Oh, definitely. And I'd like you to talk about that.
So for the Hinckley piece specifically, I was working at the Desert Research Station with the Center for Land Use Interpretation. I was there in residence with artists Lindsay French and Marcy Benedict, and I learned not only was that site close to the site that was the subject of the movie Erin Brockovich, which was this big budget movie in the year 2000, won Julia Roberts the Oscar, but tells a very heroic tale of a working class mother who fights for environmental justice and is able to get huge payouts for the local town of Hinckley from PG&E, which is this conglomerate monolith. And so it's this like amazing heroic tale, and that's like the story that we know of that place. And part of in my work, I try to explore not only like what my primary experience of something is, but how it is culturally known, or how it might be culturally known adjacent to me in my like, white middle class kind of bubble sense, American sense, reaching out farther where it makes sense to do so. And so I read an environmental impact report for the town of Hinckley, and that's what I read out loud in the video. And so that documentary kind of voice is a real life environmental impact report that basically states, everyone got these economic payouts, but the plume, and it's actually the water that's been contaminated at Hinckley, the toxic plume of hexavalent chromium is still slowly spreading. And there's, in the environmental impact report, there's a lot of detailed information on efforts to remediate it and contain it. There's bacterial attempts, there's like physical barrier attempts. And so what I chose to do for that piece was to take a single sigh from the movie Erin Brockovich, which is originally performed by Albert Finney, who is playing the lawyer Ed Masry. And in that sigh in the movie is kind of the moment where Erin Brockovich has been shouting at him for like half the movie at this point, that he needs to do something and get off his ass and like be active. And he's frustrated. He's being challenged in everything that he knows to be true about his role in the world. He's annoyed, but he also knows that work needs to happen, things need to get done. So it's a sigh of like exasperation and acceptance. So he just gives this like, he turns around and he faces the camera and he just gives this like, just this huge sigh. And so I chose to re-perform that sigh. I mean, it becomes an indistinguishable sigh kind of over the course of the piece. You can't tell. It's like, oh yes, that's the Ed Masry, Albert Finney sigh. But like, but I'm keeping his sigh in mind as thinking of it as a re-performance of that sigh in all of these different sites in Hinckley that are still affected by this expanding plume. So we still have roadside signs that are of new local activists that are trying to continually stem the tide or even potentially get themselves another payout, but that it's an ongoing kind of battle. And so the sigh for me becomes one of also exasperation, but like a kind of disillusionment with the heroic narrative, the idea that like we have this one great moment of environmentalism, and then the environment is fixed and saved and the people are compensated, and then we can move on to other victories. It's an acknowledgement that the work is more complicated than that. It's more ongoing, it's more perpetual. So
it becomes I think, in some ways it becomes a symbolic action that really speaks to the vulnerability that you were speaking of the molecular exchange, which, in turn has a daily impact, on these people's lives. And that really comes out in the performance as well, in her dialogue with him, and this kind of separation. But how can these people be sanely communicating when they're being poisoned by these invisible sources, which is down to environmental regulation. So it's really kind of creating all these layers of complexity in the structure of the piece. And going back to, and I think that leads us into this question about, I'm intrigued what your process is for, you talked about the craft of a performance. Do you start off, well, my personal do you start off with a script, for instance, or how are you? How do you begin or come up with an idea and start the process?
So, I think my process is pretty nonlinear, and like I talk about it I'm teaching contemporary practices to students at the University of Florida right now, and I talk about sketching in multiple forms. And part of where that comes from for me is my own process has a kind of multi-layered level or understanding of sketching. So for the Untitled Hinckley piece, I knew that I wanted to start with this reperformance of this sigh. But then it took me, and I had a creative block about the work for like years, honestly, and like didn't know what to do with it. And I had all these different pieces and I wasn't quite sure how to put them together. And part of that was also learning and to accept and honor my own nonlinear process. I think that when we get into these industry trainings around the arts, we start to think that there's one correct way to make the work. So like in film, we're supposed to like make a storyboard or like write the whole script out beforehand and it's perfect and then it gets passed on to the crew or whatever. And one of the things that I really appreciated about being in dialogue with my own community of artists or my own training is that, there's a part of that that just gets thrown out the window and it becomes more of a collage type process. So talking about, for instance, the performance last night, it started in a dialogue with Ray, and I was like, hey, I know what these tools can do now, because we had just finished a work in December. And I was thinking about this idea of a guided meditation. He came up with some things that he had been thinking about. I created a series of videos. He started to assemble them into a structure. I altered some code and like entered that into a thing. I started to shape the script around what we were building. The script changed as the tech changed. So like the last video, like the last kind of end of the video, which was going to be a step down, which actually was going to be based on this Flickr fusion threshold work. Initially, I was thinking of like wanting to step through the medium of this pixelated technology and get to a place of stillness. And I thought that the frame rate would be a great way to do that I could slow down frame rates. But the reality of like the integrity of the tech is that there's no way to do that authentically when you're live streaming via Twitch. Like we can't slow the frame rate down. You're always going to be getting this, whatever Twitch is streaming, this like 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second, depending on what your bandwidth is. And so we got into a very deep conversation, and it just felt and I think this is where my performance art training and my theater training start to navigate with each other. Where it's just like, theater training might tell me like, yes, that's okay, it's a spectacle, right? But in the performance art training, there's this real deep consideration of materiality. So when Ray says to me like, I don't know about this, I'm just like, you know what, you're right. There's like a material integrity that's lacking in that. And so that's when we transitioned to this idea of stepping down through bit depths and color, and that was something that we could authentically represent and still produce this experience of like stepping down backwards through the medium. But it's I guess in summation, I would say like my process is a devised one if I use theater terms, but I also think that devised process where you're trying stuff out, seeing where it works, adjusting the work to match, adapting it to a new location, responding to dialogue with collaborators, like taking on new information and new research, letting that inform the shape of the work. That like brainstorming non-linearity is like comfortable space for me at this point. So I'm no longer.
And
Yeah.
it really allows the work to breathe. Because it's, it's like my professor at Goldsmiths, who trained me, she was like, Corinne, go on a walkabout. And, going on this walk where you're listening to what magically presents itself to you in the process of making. It becomes a process where the work really starts to build itself. And so I think that really allows a work to breathe and have a jouissance, embedded in it, which I think your work last night. And I would really encourage the listeners to check out the performance last night, and all the links are on our social media. And it's up live on the experimental Twitch channel for the next 2 weeks. And, so this articulate and takes me to going back to this idea of, as part of that intuitive process of making the performance that you did last night with Ray Oppenheimer. And by the way, I'd love to see a photo of some of his scenes in OBS, because I bet they're really like complicated, like these web structures. But
if you go to his Instagram is at DangerOps, or I've actually got a picture that he posted of his signal map of all of the different video and audio from last night on my Instagram.
Oh, really? Oh, wow! Oh, I'd love to see that.
But he had a programming computer and a streaming computer, and has all of the kind of various programs and their data paths mapped out, which was at my prompting, where basically I was like, Ray, could you show me how you've got it all linked together at this point? Because we would just add continual layers, I would say like, well, what if we did this? And Ray would be like, give me 5 seconds and another computer, and it's just like, and then it would just like get more complex. And that I think that's part of the joy of that collaboration for me, is that we've just been building and feeding off each other in the virtual space during the pandemic.
So. Yeah, I mean, that's what I've loved working with artists as well over to adapting the technology to what the artists want to do, in this instant dialogue and this illusion. So that takes me to the next question that I wanted to talk to you about. And in thinking about the performance that you did last night, and really thinking about the image, the digital image. And there was part of that. So Meghan last night was walking us through this idea of the pixel was a character, in the performance. And, I really loved the synchronicity, by the way. I think you managed to get that, because we talked about that in terms of refining the performance. But, thinking about how the digital image is changing over this time. I think we as artists are constructing images in the process. And this idea of, and you spoke about this this blur, and there's a theoretician at Cambridge University called Nishka Bailey, who talks about the entangled digital diffractile images creating this digital dust in our lives, but how you are like blurring these edges between what is real and what is fiction, what is myth, what becomes invisible, what becomes real. How are you thinking about that yourself in terms of how you're composing digital images in the process of a performance?
That's a really great question. And I feel like for me, it comes down to paths, one of which is that in performance, we're always talking about documentation and its relationship to the original live work and what constitutes like authenticity or integrity in the context of the work. So that's almost like a program that's always running in the background for me is this perpetual question of like, what is the construction of this image? What's its relationship to the work? And then the other component of that for me, which I think you catch a little bit of in the works that we saw in the talk today, which is I felt like a really long time ago that to be environmentalist or to have an ecological impulse or to seek connection with the ecological world wasn't always through a cultural vernacular that is like traditionally tied to like biggie environmentalism or like a white activist environmentalism even. And I was, not to say that that doesn't articulate my work, because it totally does, because that's part of where I'm coming from. But just that like I've perpetually sought in my work, like how do I seek ecological connection when I'm talking to a houseplant? How do I seek ecological connection when I'm, in my house with my laptop? How do I seek ecological connection when I'm reading a book, or, when I'm in places that we might not associate with like capital N nature, and so that's a perpetual question for me in the work. And we had this like really fun discovery when we were making the streaming work last night, which was that when I brought the green plant into view, that the camera starts to read it as part of the green screen. And that just opened up this whole avenue of thought for the work, which is like, oh, like the digital ecology, this digital void that we're all kind of connected through in pixels. And that becomes a design choice too, where it's like, I bring the plant into the frame and we see what's happening, and Ray's like, well, I can make X, Y, Z changes to make that the presence of that plant like more pronounced, more like planty in the frame. And I'm like, actually, I think that this works, and depending on my lighting, the plant becomes more or less visible as well. So it's trying to think of this sense of documentation in relationship to the work, and also like kind of seeking ecological connection from whatever context you're working from, whether it's big in nature or not. So
yeah. So I do want to open it up to the audience to ask questions. So please type in your questions in the chat. And we haven't had a chance to talk about the second performance. Can you wear a headset where you're using breath and this is being visualized on the screen? And this kind of ties in with what you were just talking about in terms of this anthropocentric or the refusal of the Anthropocene that you employ when you're creating the structures for your performances. You know, you're really thinking about, well, or are you thinking about decentering the human within the context of the work?
I feel like I'm always in a conversation about this question of like non-human collaborators, and so I guess I've come to the point where I feel like my own perspective as a human is inescapable, and that the work that I can do to attempt to attune to the non-human is generative, even if it's an impossible task. Where it's like, I don't know what it's like to be a pixel. I'm never going to know what it's like to be a pixel. I'm not going to know what it's like to be a penguin swimming in the John Ball Zoo. But the attention that I give to that non-human animal or that entity has capacity, has the potential to generate new dialogues and shift cultures, potentially, hopefully, and shift perspectives, because the default setting for us and our current culture is anthropocentric, and so to reach outward from that, I think, is important and generative. Where questions of collaboration, I think, become iffy. Like when I bring the plant into the frame, like there's a question of like, oh, did this plant consent to be part of this performance? Like, I'm not sure that it did, but I'm working with it nonetheless. So like the question of like non-human collaboration or totally decentralizing the human, I think, is difficult, because I think we have to really think about like non-human agency. But for that breath piece, what I'm wearing is an EEG headset. It's a Bluetooth EEG headset, so it's measuring my brain waves, and I'm really just trying to take a moment to potentially establish connections between frame rates, which is where the term flicker fusion threshold comes from. Flicker fusion threshold is the moment at which we as humans perceive motion based on a series of still images. So we might see stuttery still images, and at the flicker fusion threshold, the frame rate is enough that we see those sequenced still images as fluid motion. So it's respiration rates and frame rates, and trying to use my own body as a kind of connective force between those two things. Being real, it's also, I made it in 2016, and my own body felt very vulnerable in conservative West Michigan in a context where Trump had just been elected. So speaking to that capacity of breath to acknowledge that vulnerability became important for the piece. And we've seen in the subsequent impact of the Trump administration that those things are not fully separate. The presence of Trump in the White House is not fully separate from the management of these ecosystems and how they've been impacted and shaped. So trying to acknowledge all of that within the scope of the piece as much as possible. I will say also that part of the impetus for bringing the EEG headset in is that there's been a fair number of studies at this point on long-term meditators and the effect of meditation on brain waves. And so wanting to open up an opportunity for the audience to see in real time how my breaths were affecting the individual brainwaves that I was creating at any given moment.
Yeah, and that really goes back to the physiological impact of your work both intern, and we had this conversation with Ma as well, talking about the internal and external impact, you know. And Martine Vial has shared in the chat that I like the idea of tension and perspectives in connection with breath. So thank you. And thank you. And Dimple shares, thank you, Meghan, for sharing your wonderful work. I mean, it was hard to choose really what to show today because there is such a huge portfolio of work. So I'd really recommend that you check out more of Meghan's work. And Dimple says there are multiple ways we connect, and our understanding of reality is different. It is with different perceptions that we understand now is abstract to reality. And yes, I was thinking about that because there was, I just recently heard this woman talk who has recently written a book on glitch feminism and talking about the abstraction of the digital realm. And, you know, going back to Bailey's thoughts and thinking about the entanglement, but also talking about the materiality of the digital realm. And I wonder if you have thoughts, especially after yesterday's performance. You know, I think that came out in the Hinckley, play this in the Hinckley. Is this relationship between digital to abstractionism, and is there, and how this relates to glitch feminist approaches and how we can think about that? How might we imagine that going forward?
So I do think that my own choice to occupy my own body in performance is essentially a feminist choice. I do. I just wrote a long diatribe for a piece about my own gender presentation, basically, and I'm much more comfortable on what could be described as a masculine presenting kind of end of the spectrum. But I use she, her pronouns. I've recently started to incorporate they to give space for other articulations of gender. And I think part of what's also going on for me in Untitled Hinckley is deciding to occupy that distinctly, deciding to occupy a mask of center space in a distinctly unpretty way, while Julia Roberts plays out glitched over the screen. and for me, part of the exasperation is, and I'm revealing my like 90s upbringing at this point, but like coming up with I like in moments of the media now, it's amazing how many queer, trans, non-binary folks are emerging in a lot of different kind of cultural media, and there was just so much less of that growing up in the 80s and 90s, and a real pressure to be a specific kind of femininity or a specific kind of woman. And I say woman with like all of the vowels turned into, you know, different symbols or whatnot. But yeah. And so for me, every time that I choose to put myself in front of a camera with the understanding that I might not fit some folks' idea of what deserves to be in front of a camera, is a feminist choice. And that is sometimes emotionally expensive for me, and sometimes I want to redirect my energies to other things. And I'm looking a lot at like collaborative performance now as a way to negotiate that. So for me, the glitch becomes a way of disrupting that pristine kind of, I don't know, Hollywood patriarchal sheen, which is also being disrupted without pixelation in some other like mainstream media forms, in where queer, trans, and non-binary performers are occupying more narrative spaces and more traditional narrative forms. So
Yeah, and
for me.
yeah, and that's really important for the work that we do with Out of Sight, is really creating a platform for LGBTQ artists. We had a whole diversity of people performing last night, in the program, and continue to advocate, and that's very important to me personally, growing up in the queer community as a child with queer parents, and really thinking about, there weren't the diversity of voices when we were growing up, and it was illegal back then. Now, Ika Trinks has another lovely comment in the chat. She says, "Thanks for your performance last night, Meghan." Well, thanks for staying up, Ika. It must have been the early hours for you. The beginning particularly made me think of Ce n'est pas une pipe by Magritte's pipe, and the conceptual art of Kossuth's 1 and 3 chairs. It's not you who we look at, it's a digital representation. And it's particularly a computer-generated representation. So next to understanding pixels, I wondered how the self for you played a role in this. So that's a really interesting question, and perhaps you've already touched on that a little bit, and how important it is for you to respond to the medium, like thinking like, and this is part of the conversation. This is like part of what we're exploring and thinking about at the moment, is how does the digital medium become an empowered narrative for us as feminist artists or as queer artists? How do we redefine this space? So some interesting questions there.
So thanks so much for that question. To touch on that, because I think this is relevant to Wanape's question as well. Logistically, what was happening last night was that I had a Skype connection with Ray, and I had a digital green screen behind me. And I had created a bunch of background videos, which I delivered to Ray and controlled. He had built into a series of OBS scenes. He also routed my live stream image through another computer, through the program Isadora, which had a glitch shader running, so that every time he pressed a button live, I would glitch live. So all of the glitches that you saw were Ray activating live in this space. And that was a script and a lot of rehearsal and just us getting on the same page to how the scenes were changing and how I was responding to the space. And then I would change a background video and update it and send to Ray, and we would kind of be in that conversation. But in terms of like the idea of the self, I feel like one of the things that I've been in conversation with about the self in my own work for a while is when I say I'm Mo, being 100% present with the real me, whatever that is, the actual Mo that other humans know and talk to, while knowing really distinctly that this Mo that exists in performance is a specific splice of Mo or a kind of tangent of Mo, and a different version of Mo. than you might meet in a coffee shop or walking down the street or in a classroom. And I think that's something that when we talk about performance, there's always this question of like, and I think this is part of what makes more violent and volatile and risky performance really like urgent and scary for a lot of people, is because some audiences can't distinguish between the real Mo and the performer Mo. Like that there's an understanding that like, oh, if the Mo in performance does this, then the Mo in real life will do the same, not acknowledging the frame that performance itself creates. And so for here in this digital space, the apparatus provides another like frame or layer. And I like to think of engagements with the non-human as a dialogue in my work. And so that's part of what the intro is a little bit about, is that I'm very literally being shaped by the technology, and acknowledging that kind of non-human agency in the craft of the work, as well as my own kind of centrality as the human performer. But I definitely think that there's some influence of Magritte and some conceptual work happening there, as well as whole dialogues around modernism and postmodernism, kind of in the intent to engage with the medium as a framing device, or as it is, as it were. But that also for me comes from a desire to cultivate presence, both as a device in performance, but as a potentially remediative tool, that like presence is something that we hold as performers, but that it's also something really crucial for relationships and healing and dialogue, basically. I hope that makes sense. That felt like a bit of a collage of words.
That is phenomenal. And I feel like we could talk about this for another hour. And we have so many amazing reflections and comments in the chat. There's a couple from Sarah, who says, deciding to occupy this non-binary space. And to me, working physically within digital becomes a confusion of control, which is, I think, very interesting. And, definitely, hopefully part of our ongoing conversation here. Thanks. And Wanapa said, that's quite a collaboration and a thoughtful process of rehearsal. Thank you for sharing. And Dimple said, it is wonderful for Corin to put all three abstract, glitch, feminism, and digital pixels together. But this is part of an expanded dialogue that's really happening within ecofeminism at the moment. And so it's not just myself, Dimple, but it is very fascinating. So
I want to acknowledge Duff's comment too. The medium is the message. Absolutely, an influence. And I want to have a moment of transparency too, and that is that the last 4 or 5 minutes of the performance last night, where I'm doing the bit depth step down, the glitches that are happening are live. The video itself is pre-recorded, because what we came to in our collaboration was that I could do the bit depth authentically within the technology, but that for it to happen in real time the way that we needed, it needed to be a pre-recorded video. So the performance is live up until that last portion, at which point Ray is glitching live, but my presence is a pre-recorded video. But we're hoping that in order to, like, ironically, the live stream needed to be eliminated in order to be fully authentic with the engagement with the technology and the concept. So I hope that makes sense. But I just wanted to be transparent about that as a structure for the work.
So we've really had an amazing conversation here today, and I just want to share with everybody, we have got an exciting well, we've just begun the spring session of Artist Focus. So next week, I'm speaking to Adriana Disman, who's currently in London. She's from Canada, and a really incredible lineup of artists still to come for the spring session of Artist Focus. And oops, hang on a minute. And I just wanted to also share with everybody that we have lots of opportunities on our website. So if you would like to do a live performance and really become part of the Out of Sight community, because we have built this open platform for our artists to share their work, and it is an ongoing relationship over many years. Like, I've had Meghan, and we've built this platform to share our artists' work. So, and the artists in the community are really shaping it, and it's evolving. So if you wish to become part of our community and you want to do a live stream performance with Out of Sight this year, we do have stipends available, and the link to that is on our website. We also have a public performance symposia coming up in April, and there will be training the conference participants to live stream, and there will be 2 days where conference participants will be able to share a performance online, and that will be a public event. And the last opportunity that we have is for civic engagement projects in Chicago and public performances in Chicago in the summer of 2021, and that's supported with Chicago Park District. Thank you. And it's always a delight to work with other institutions, and we've really kind of develop these collaborations to create services for artists. And so we had a fascinating conversation today, and I think we've just started to scratch the surface, really, of what the digital medium and the material of the digital medium can offer, in terms of a feminist approach, in terms of a queer approach, and thinking about how we reshape these narratives, and challenge the binary narratives in the digital realm. So, but we started off the conversation about talking about performance practices and how Meghan actually constructs a performance through this process, and how it's really intuitive. It becomes research, it becomes intuitive, and it becomes a listening process to what can, and then which allows the work to really take on a life of its own. So this deep engagement with the work, I do encourage you to check out her work. Please check out her website. I'm going to post that in the chat because she has lots of incredible projects. You can also find her work on the Out of Sight website. We have links there. And I want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us today. Please consider supporting Out of Sight. We really are a community of artists. When you support Out of Sight, you're actually funding a huge community of artists, and we're thinking about how we can actually create an economic support channel for our artists as we speak. So we'll be talking about that more to come. But thank you so much to our audience. Thank you to Mo, and Have you got any last words that you would like to say, Mo?
I just want to say thank you so much, Karen. You just do such incredible, extensive, generous work for Out of Sight and for the greater performance community, and really grateful to be kept in the loop of this group and community. And yeah, thanks for having me here. Thanks for hosting the work and doing everything that you do. So
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, big thanks to everybody in the audience, and lovely to be with you all today. And please join us next week for Adriana Disman. And you can check out all the links to the live performances last night on the Experimental Sound Studio Twitch feed. So thank you so much. Cheerio. Bye bye.